Governing with agility is the talk today. I just want to acknowledge that anything that you see in the work that goes into this agile governance work that you see, or governing with agility, that I've done this work with Phil Gudzinski. We've been working together, and Phil's been in the agile bastions for probably as long as I have. So we've done a lot of work around this, and usually we talk together. Unfortunately, Phil couldn't make it tonight. That's okay. I'll fulfill his part as well, and probably do it better than him. I'm just saying that because he's going to see recording. So brilliant. All right. So let's talk about agile first. If we're talking about governing agility and agile governance, or however you want to put it, we need to stop and think about agile just a little bit to start with, right? And if you think about agile, why is agile so important at the moment? And I'm sure if you're on this call that you've come across the term, it's a VUCA world, right? Volatility, uncertain, complex, and ambiguity, right? You've all probably heard that, so I'm not going to bang on too much about that. But when we think about it, Phil and I, we think about it a little different. So what we're thinking about it is the complex interplay of extrinsic and intrinsic factors, right? So if you think about that in terms of what we're saying is there's extrinsic motivational actions that arise from external factors that actually play into creating VUCA with inside your organisation, not just outside your organisation. So therefore, you have these intrinsic factors that are driven by your internal mechanisms, your internal structures, as well as the external or extrinsic factors. That'll become a little bit more reasoning as we get further in. So then let's talk about Agile. A lot of people say, well, what is Agile? I think if I had a dime over I'm in my third decade of doing agility. There's a couple of others here that hang around that size. If I've asked a million times what Agile is, I actually sort of coalesce towards Alistair Coburn's explanation of it, right? And that's that ability to move and change direction quickly and with ease. And really, that nimble ability to move is all you need. That's what Agile was created. It was created in that instance. And with us moving into that VUCA environment, those extrinsic and intrinsic factors, agility gives you that ability, or Agile gives you that ability to move and change direction and quickly with ease, whilst applying mechanisms to it. What a lot of people don't talk about, though, is the byproduct of Agile. And for me, the byproduct of Agile is agility, which is a little different, right? Agile's the thinking, or the philosophy is the way I like to think of it. Agility is the outcome. It's that thing that gives you the speed of information flow that leads to action. That's the stock and trade of Agile and agility. It allows you to have that information in short, sharp cycles that allow you to make expedient decisions and to adapt and change based on that information that's coming in, whether that be coming out of software with velocity or whatever it be, or it be knowledge work, or it be procurement, HR, it doesn't matter. It's still speed of information flow to allow you to lead to that action that allows you to move and adapt, which is important in the VUCA world that we're talking about, right? So if we think about that and just keep that premise, information flow, decision to action to change. That's really where we're at. So then we think about it and we go, okay, well, that means that, agility or Agile, we've all heard it's being adopted across the world. And we are, discussing earlier on here, we were all talking about the fact that it's come from software. We all know it came from software, right? And, 17 people got together and created this thing, but it certainly jumped that shark a long time ago. And so if you think about it now, it's actually, if you look at it at the moment, if you walk into any organisation, if I look at 10 years ago, I would have to put a case forward for why we should do Agile, right? And let's face it, it's been around 20 years. It's not new. And, most companies will tell you, in fact, that they're doing Agile in some way. Whether they're doing well or not, that's not up to me. But intrinsically, in most organisations that are doing software, they've probably got some sort of Agile and reasonably do it well. And if you look at the DevOps report or the State of Agility report, I think it's something like 96% of organisations across the world have that kind of agility. But what we're seeing is we're seeing it cross the chasm now, right? It's making that shift from Agile software to business agility. So organisations across the world are adopting business agility and the intent is high. And just to put some premise around that, as you can see, the annual Deloitte business survey surveys 67% of the respondents that business agility is a high priority in the organisation. If you look at the dichotomy of the slice there, it's 32% extremely high, 35% high. But the reality of it is that business agility is being adopted across the world. Why do I bring that to the table? Well, I bring that to the table because that, along with Agile, has really created this paradigm change, right? And it's moved it from software to Agile management. We've seen that. And then finally, it's now evolved to this agility for the organisation. And what that means is the entire system of work requires a change. But the change is in how we govern the system as a whole, because we're expanding to business agility across organisations, across the whole of the organisation. Let me just say, when I talk about governing tonight, it's going to challenge you if you're thinking only in PMOs and projects and that kind of governance. I'm talking about governance as the system as a whole. So I'm going to put that premise for you because we're changing the frame of reference around it. So in that radical shift to Agile, though, most organisations have become transitional, not transformational. So rhetorical question, but I'm sure everyone said, we're doing a transformation. But the reality of it is they're actually transitional. They're not transformational. And why is that? And it's because of this. What we end up with is these 3-speed economies within organisations. And I heard some of you talking about before, that's why I was biting my tongue. You know, if you look at it, normally what happens is agility gets functioned in and we change the frame or the patterns of work, and we fix the teams theoretically, and we apply this agility to the teams because that's the easiest way to do it. We might even touch a little bit of that funding and governing, but usually what you find is the two are on different tracks in different directions. And even worse, we don't touch the systems and strategy. And essentially we know that leadership in itself is often the last bastion of change. So therefore we end up with a 3-speed economy in terms of the organisation itself. So if you think about that radical shift to Agile and the things that we've just talked about, what's the missing thing? We forgot about governance. We forgot about governance. When we had this shift, we moved to Agile, we made tribes, we changed teams, we created trains. I had to get that in there. We forgot about governance. We forgot about how we govern the system as a whole. So let me just premise that again. When I stop there, I go, we're talking about governing the system as a whole, how you govern it in an Agile way. So if we're going to talk about governance, which is what we are going to do a little bit, what does it really mean? Well, governance is the action or manner of governing a state or an organisation. Or if you like, how we think about it is it's how we intend to actually govern our organisation purposefully with purposeful intent if it's done properly. So when you think about governance, it has controls, right? And you put a lot of controls in place. And when you have a large organisation with large states of leaders that are responsible for large scales of outcomes, that don't have visibility, they're not close to the work, or they're not understanding what the work is, then what happens with governance? We put in controls. We put in controls from risk, from audit, from all of those perspectives, right? What we're really looking for is the assurance of control. So the question is, what kind of control should we be putting in? What kind of controls are we putting in? So that brings us to, well, all right, if you're talking about that, what do you mean by that? What is Agile governance then in terms of that, right? Well, you can see that statement there. It applies the values and principles of Agile as first described in the manifesto to the whole of the organisation. So we were talking about that as well previously. It was some great segues that you created for me tonight, right? It's more about the values and the principles, and we'll talk about that as we go, but it is those values as described, right? So if you think it's individuals and interactions over processes and tools, we value the working software, we value the customer collaboration, we value responding to change. But a lot of our governance models are not designed around that. They're actually designed around the right, right? So the problem with it is that they are more about the processes than the tools, or they're more about the comprehensive documentation as a measure of assurance, control, or progress. They're looking at controls about what are our terms of contract, is procurement, have we done what procurement said? Are we in alignment over the customer? Have we got that collaboration and get that outcome? They're not looking at the collaboration outcome, right? And they're often looking at the plan rather than responding to change, assuring that we're on track, we're on plan. We haven't changed the plan. Things have gone wrong and we need to inspect and adapt, right? We need to do something different. Don't get me wrong, planning's good, but it's the plan that needs to change. And the problem with that is that we don't do that. And traditional governance really is looking more on the right. We're saying, look at the values on the left and think about that, right? So what we're asking you to do is start looking at the manifesto, start looking at those governance against those values in the manifesto, because that's what we want to look at applying. And when we start thinking about that, then we start thinking about how it establishes those mechanisms, constraints by which we really design and execute and guide the deliveries of its strategies in an ongoing and the most important word, adaptive fashion. We're looking for adaptive. Right, so let's think about that. Why do we want to do that? So if you think about traditional governance, everything looks like a nail. And that's no difference to the traditional methods of governance. They were matured over years against processes that were static, and we didn't have this kind of speed of change and speed of movement that we require to actually be competitive anymore, right? And when you're not really knowing what is occurring, where the work gets done, it really creates and invites risk. So when we move to this agile mechanism, somebody said before, it changes autonomy. Yes, it does, but you actually have to take on the ability of agile that creates that information flow, because delays in elevating that information just increase risk. And I love this quote from Kent Bett: silence is the sound of risk piling up. And on a project, when you're not getting that information, or program of work, or in your organization, you're not getting that short, sharp flow back of information quickly, then we have a problem. So I'm going to read some numbers here. I'm going to be honest, because I'm an agilist, not a mathematician, right? But let's just solidify that point, right? So let's take the example. We make about 35,000 decisions a day. Now, this PPP Internet studies say that's probably around that. Whatever they say, whether that was correct or not doesn't matter to me, right? But leaders and teams are making many, many, many decisions per person per day. So I'm just going to stop. I want you to think in your head, how many directional decisions did you make today? Right. So even if we significantly reduce that 35,000 number, and let's say for argument's sake, this is where I'll read some numbers out, right? The teams are making up to 10 directional impact and decisions every day, 5 days a week, 46 days a week, 46 weeks per year per person, right? That's 2,300 potentially wrong decisions every year per person compounded that's available for them to make. And each wrong decision that's made increases the misalignment on the top of the previous incorrect decision, increases the risk. The silence is piling up, right? And if the information flow is truncated in any way or delayed, then the error rate of those decisions that are based on the information you were getting now become gut feel, highest paid person's opinion. It becomes pure guess. It becomes exponential. So we need to manage that risk. And, the inference that agility doesn't manage risk, I've heard that before. We do manage risk, but we actually do it in a different way. Right? So traditional governance models are kind of the same sort of what I was just talking about, right? We just hit everything on the head with it. And even when it's not working, the general thought is we apply more controls, more governance, more controls, more governance. And essentially what we do is end up truncating the information flow, which creates the ability or the disability for us to get that information. And then we end up where I was talking about before. So I just want to take a little bit of a right-hand turn, right? And talk about governance in itself, because you often hear what it's described as, right? It's oversight, it's decision-making, spending, it's the audit, it's compliance, it's forecasting, expenses and measurement, right? Or you might even hear lean governance. Now, I just want to preface, I am not poking at the safe framework here at all. It's just that they happen to have a very good diagram that shows that in there, right? And in their model, they talk about lean governance, the oversight, decision-making, spending, audit, compliance, forecasting, expenses and measurement, just what I just said. That's how it's described. Interestingly enough, though, funny, where's the other three parts of the puzzle in that governance? It's not thinking of the sum of the whole. You might even call it described as rageism. Now, this is what I found, which piqued my interest. Recipes for agile governance in the enterprise. Now, I'm not saying there's not good things in there, but if you have a look at it, there's certainly a lot of things that are missing. And in fact, it really is erring towards the process and the tools and the comprehensive documentation, and not really looking at the sum of the whole. It's even looking at, well, how do these things control it, right? And again, I'm not here to bag that. I'm just using them as examples of how you hear governance actually portrayed. But for Phil and I, this is not governing with agility. This is not governing with agility. And why? Well, the compelling need for governing with agility is governance is really that forgotten element of the organizations, right? It's adopting these new models. It's thinking about how they're based on a goal of enabling agility and creating a more adaptable system of work, right? So if you think about it, in this instance, people get rushed into this new way of working. They don't understand it. And what becomes of that, there's an inherent problem with this through this story. It's repeated, especially every time, right? Especially you take your direction from large multinational organizational companies that give you a cookie cutter repackaged method that they saw work at another organization, or perhaps it was designed on a music app. Remember, when you do that, the quickest way to bring problems into your organization is to copy somebody else's way of working, because you're getting their problems and your problems, and you may not solve any of those. So what we want to think about is how we enable that agility and use those adaptive systems of work that allow us to harness the power of Agile while still thinking about governing the system of work. Just going to grab a drink. And I managed to splash that. So if we think about governance, what is it really about, right? Governance is controlling the delivery of your strategy. And I love this, Stan McChrystal, if you haven't read Team of Teams, it's a fantastic book. And I love the way he describes it, right? If you think about it, governance is really about controlling the delivery of a strategy. It's sharing that as strategic intent that allows the people that flexibility. It allows them to decide where, how, and when. And if you think about agile teams, that's what we're looking for, that autonomy of change, with still the guide rails and the boundaries and what they need to do to actually achieve the common objective. If you give people that ability to do so, they actually will do it. And if you think it, governance really should be controlling the delivery of our strategy and assuring the delivery of our strategy. We just have to start thinking about how we ask different questions against it, how we look for different controls, how we look for this matches the way we want to work, or maybe the way we thought we worked, right? We want to rethink governance as a whole to allow us to achieve our strategy. So what is Agile governance really about? What are we trying to achieve by doing Agile governance? Well, what we're trying to achieve or enable is integrity, right? And we're trying to enable transparency and trust throughout our entire system of work. That's the intent, that's the goal. That doesn't come easily, but we've been doing some work around this for quite some time, myself and Phil. And what we have distilled this into is something that we feel that will allow and enable organizations to do so. And I'm going to talk a little bit deeper into that now. So I know I spent a bit of time setting all those premises, but now I think it's time to talk about what we see is the way forward and how we actually put this together. And a lot of the ideas here will not be new. I'm going to say that, right? But we bring them together in a way we think that will allow you to inject agility into the system. I say think, but we know because we've been using them, and I'll give you some examples of that. And we brought them together. I want to make the point here, it's not a framework, right? This is intent-based. It's meant to be guidance. It's a set of observations. It's a set of questions to be asked. It allows you to frame it, not framework it. Okay. So we call it the stanchions of governing with agility, right? Stanchions being those things that hold the house up, poles, whatever you like. So the first thing what we think about is conductive leadership, right? And conductive leadership is not talking about electricity. By the way, let me just be really clear about that. It all starts with leadership, right? And you have to change the way you lead, or you cannot change the way you govern. It's an extremely critical element. And we'll talk a little bit into conductive leadership. I'll dig into each of these a little deeper in the time that I've got at my hands. I'm keeping an eye on it. Okay, so the second part of that is organisational transparency. You know, agile ways of working give us this amazing system of work that generates transparent information. And instead of recreating that information multiple times over multiple systems into status reporting and elements that use the power of transparency, why not use the actual transparency that the system gives you, and that gives you the data that you can use to make that decisioning and make those changes to your system and allow you to adapt, right? And in tandem with that, you know, is that data-driven decision that it allows you to do. Right? Gives you an incredible amount of data that we use effectively, and we can efficiently use it to help us make the right decisions. So we talk about decisions being made on fact. Add into that patterns of work, right? We're talking about the systems of work, the whole of the systems of work. You know, what is the system itself? You know, I talked about the operating model context before. So we need to look at the ways of working, and we looked at how you can use that to inform your governance. And then that brings us to the most important piece, which is the cornerstone of that, right? Which is people are important. In all of this, we hardly touch the people. Well, people are important. Agile's really about the people and really about the people that do the work. So remember that's, you know, what it's really leading to is that management business agility revolution that we have today is that humanity is the cornerstone of doing so. And none of this works without the people. But it often gets lost in the control mechanisms of traditional governance. I'm going to dig a bit deeper. I'm just watching my time. So if I think about it, conductive leadership, let me just touch base again there. It's not about electrocuting or electricity, right? It's about conductive leadership in the terms of thinking about leadership now in terms of a conductor. So rhetorical question to you is, do you see a conductor actually doing the work? Do you see the actual conductor actually playing the instrument? No, but he's giving direction. He's taking input. He's giving it back. He's leading with intent. And I stereotype that. It could be a he or a she, but it's leading with intent, right? I give you the guide rails, you give me intent, I lead in that way. And in an agile system, you need that leading with intent. You need to change that. You need to give the autonomy. And by putting in agile, by the way, it's one of the biggest struggles that comes to leadership is because the agile in its own right, by rote, creates the dissemination of control. So therefore, what happens is leadership, then if they haven't addressed this or you haven't thought of the system of work, literally what happens is the only lever that you can pull is command. And you'll hear those inferences of you must, you should, you have to, they will, they won't, right? So what we need to do is start moving to that leading with intent, and we have to give them the guided decision. We need to apply that guided decision in the way that we apply the right guide rails that allow them to make the decisions, have the autonomy within the bounds that allow them to understand when they need to escalate that information in the right way, in the right place at the right time. And that creates that clarity of outcome. So that's what leadership's meant to do, right? Create that clarity of outcome. So never forget, what's a leader's job? And a leader's job, if you look at the old Jack Welch quote, is actually to clear the blockers and get the hell out of the way so your people can do the work. So we need to be looking at that, not putting in governance mechanisms, not putting in those controls and adding to the organisational detritus that just keeps piling up so much that we don't even know why we do that, because that's just the way we always did it. And that means we are allowed them to make expedient interventions. They can spend more time on making expedient interventions because they're not actually in every single meeting. They're not actually trying to get right down to the floor and make the decisions of the work. And particularly with the remote frame, that's become something that's happened a lot over the period of time. There's a lot more to that, but I don't have time to dig into it too much deeper. Organisational transparency. So organisational transparency, yes, it's a double-edged sword, but if it's used right, it invites inquiry. And transparency and the organisational transparency is required for leadership. This is why we have them linked together. Leaders need that organisational transparency to have the information, to be able to understand what's going on, to be able to lead with intent, to apply the right guide rails to make the expedient decisions. That brings you to transparency as well. It invites inquiry. It breaks down the silos. You know, we have a saying in remote.af is silos become chasms. And the intent of organisational transparency is to create or recreate what we call the connective collaborative tissues of your organisation. When you pull teams apart, when you put them together, when you apply control mechanisms, when you add in all of these new holding methods that you put in place, you're actually breaking the connective collaborative tissues of your information. And so what you have is information either horizontally or vertically truncated, and you don't have that connect with your strategic intent. And that's why we need strategic alignment. By connecting your collaborative tissues both horizontally across your organisation, vertically, that creates the strategic alignment, but it also creates bidirectional information flow, right? So there's a concept called bifurcation of knowledge. In many organisations that have traditional governance, the knowledge is held at the strategic level. It filters down to certain levels and it may not get down to where it's necessarily needed. And that truncation of that means that you're actually not all moving in the same direction of travel. So by instilling the bidirectional transparency of flow and giving the organisational transparency, we're plugging that in for the leaders to have that ability to do so. And again, that means that we have a better chance of delivering our strategy. What does that mean also about the patterns of work or those systems of work? One of the biggest inferences is that we must design for flow, right? Flow of information, flow of work in an organisation. And a lot of those designs, unfortunately, within the traditional models are, we do this and we stop here, we do this, we stop here, we do this, we stop here, or we hand these off, or we have these silos. So we're designing for flow. We're designing for flow of work. We're designing for flow of information. And that might require some standardization. So for traditional agilists, and I use that because it's been around 20 years now, so we've got some traditional agilists, or what I call, you know, evangelist agilists. They say, well, we can't have standardization. Well, I say to them, there's no flow without standardization. You just don't want normalization, right? So how this team works, there's some standard things we need you to do because this is an enterprise frame. You're not a startup, but we're not going to measure you in normalization by saying your velocity is that velocity or etc. Control is distributed in terms of the patterns of work. We design our work to have that control distributed to enable the transparency and to allow and use the guide rails that are set by the leaders that we talked about before. That means that also you design your patterns of work to ensure the clarity of purpose and intent. There are many ways to do so. Obviously, everybody's heard of OKRs, that's just one, but there are many ways to create that flow up and across so that everybody understands the direction of travel. And then most importantly, I love it, I took some notes here. So as we were talking before, somebody was talking about as people move from the organisation or as the knowledge flows out of the organisation, the systems of work or the patterns of work are left floundering. And that's because we need to codify the ways of working. When you hear persistent teams or that kind of thing, that's about the actual team living on. It's not about the individuals, because individuals come and go. No matter how much they love a team, you know, they may want to take a different challenge or there are different life circumstances. So we have to actually think about that and codify the ways of working so that it's well understood, so that everybody understands how that they need to move and shape within the organisation. That brings us to data-driven decision. And I left this to the bottom because it underpins everything, right? Data is the key to making fact-based decisions, right? So if you look at the old lean model, how do you get fact-based decisions? You need data. How do you get data? You measure the right things. Data trumps opinion. So if we're looking at this flow of work, and flow is our method, and we want to look at how we're governing the system in totality, and we want to enable the transparency and the leadership, then we have to be measuring the right things. Digital tools rule in that instance, because a lot of that means that you can actually access your system and you can get that real time, right? And we want to continually improve that data-driven decisioning and that ability to bring that information in. And get down to the Gemba, right? Whether that be virtually or not, the reality of it is that leaders, there is an inference for leaders that they need to understand what's happening at a level. So as much as we can do this, we also want them to get to the Gemba to pull that data in to compare that against what they're actually getting within their data sets. There's a lot more I could talk about. It's one of my passionate things, data, but we'll move on. So that brings to us to what we call the cornerstone, right? And all of that we just talked about doesn't work unless we have the humans in the mix, right? Humanity is the cornerstone of any kind of organization. Unfortunately, in traditional methods, that gets lost. Whereas what we're looking to do is to instill that trust, right? Instill that responsibility, that democracy, that fairness, and that humble in the way that we lead the organization, the way we govern the system of work. But that doesn't mean that we just let that be for a free-for-all, right? We want to trust, but we still want to verify. Rather than trust, but control. So I said before, right back up the top, that we actually have to think in a different way and ask some different questions in terms of how we assure. And we want to trust, but verify. So you said you're going to do this, or you said this, we have the data that allows us to verify that, or we have mechanisms that allow us to understand that and treat and verify it with you. We're not putting control mechanisms over them to create control rather than verification. And that statement there is a very poignant statement, because that was actually used, I think it was by Ronald Reagan, when he was dealing with many of the different foreign powers in the time. You can understand what kind of things were going on then, and basically saying to them, we're going to trust you, but we are going to verify. So don't be surprised if we ask you for information to verify. So in an organization, that's the quid pro quo. You talked about giving autonomy and your guide rails, but we're still going to verify. We're still going to ask you for certain things to understand where you are in the mix. So it's easy for me to sit here and say that, and you're going to say, oh yeah, that's really good, but can you use it? So Phil and I have used this many times now. We crystallized this about, I think it was BC, before COVID, so a good 7 or so, 8 years ago, working with organizations. We've had the opportunity. So one of the ways we use it, and there's many ways you can use this, but I just wanted to give you one example because it has multiple entry points. But when we look at organizations, we look at those things that happen within the organization. So we go look at what's happening, we look at the recommendations, we look at the opportunities within that organization. We spend time either with the Gemba or with the leaders or with the people all through the stack, right? Then we take those and we look at those observations, we generate insights out of that. We understand, what is the intent? What am I seeing? We validate those insights. Remember, trust but verify. And then off the back of that, we generate insights. So in this instance, we're looking at the pattern of work, right? So we look at that and go, what are those insights into that pattern of work? And then there's two models that we apply to that. We either apply the Kaizen model of small change for the better, right? A better backlog, create those changes, tackle them incrementally or interventionally, whatever that may be, and on a basis, and manage that and verify that. Or if we have that luck and the ability to actually do something transformationally, not just transitionally, right? So we take those recommendations and the observations, and we create a whole new system, and then we pass your work through that system. Those opportunities are quite disruptive, so it has to be an opportunity and a disruptive opportunity for you to do that. Bear in mind, whistle-stop tour, I've only just touched on the patterns of work. but you can see that if you're applying it at these different frames and the different questions, that you're actually able to get a pattern and get an observations and insights across the organisation. And we've used this at a number of organisations that we've worked for. So the other thing, and I'm not here to plug services, but I think, you know, it's important to say, if you think that you know, this is theoretical, it's not. These two organisations, both whom I've work for and work with, have applied that. They have different names for it, of course. You know, ours is more of an open source thing that we're generating. But, you know, remote.af uses the pillars of remote governance, and you can see by looking there, little different names, it's still common language. And for Elaborate, they use the pillars of agile governance. And I can tell you that those two organisations have used that with multiple organisations, large streaming services, large companies who sell lots of things and get it to you very fast. I'll leave that with you. So, got to move on. I know I'm nearly at the end of my time. So, look, I love this. This is Phil's quote, and you know he's going to take it to his end with him. But you know, if you're not using Agile in your governance system, it's like getting the keys to a Ferrari, not getting out of first gear. So let's be serious, right? If you've decided to put Agile into your organisation, you haven't addressed the way you govern your systems of work, then you've got that Ferrari that's not moving. You've got that 3-train system that I said at the beginning, 3-speed economy, never to the twain shall meet, and the organisation can only be as fast as its most agile leg. So I love Mr. Fuller. You know, he made some great quotes, and you know, let's put it this way: Agile's 20-odd years old, right? We know that it works. It jumped the shark. It's mainstream. There are still organisations taking it on. You can't change these things by fighting the existing reality, though, right? So we're not saying to you walk into an organisation tomorrow and start touting, you need to change that and change that, right? What we want to do is give you a way to build a new model that makes that existing model obsolete and allows you to change the frame of reference within your organisation. So, closing thought, Aidan. If we're moving to the next normal and you're thinking about doing that in your organisation, it needs to be considered. It needs to be intentional organisational design. And when you're considering that organisational design, you need to create or enhance the collaborative connective tissues that I talked about before that enable that communication and that information flow that allows the speed of directional decision. That, in a nutshell, is what we're thinking about when we're thinking about agile governance. So it's governing the system as a whole. It enables your organisation. One last piece. If you're interested in this, Bill and I have put together, there's a website here, which is governagility.com.au. It's sort of open source, where people are interested, get involved with it, drop in there. All of the things I talked about now in today are in there in much more depth. We've been putting that together. So any of those, the stanchions, I've only just touched the tip of that because of the time, you can see. The second thing about that is look out for the book coming soon. Yes, for those of you in the early session, that's what Shane was talking about as well. So we are writing a book, and hopefully that will be out sooner than later. Other than that, I think if you get one thing call to action when you walk away from here is today, don't apply governance to your agile. It doesn't work because your agile moves too fast. It has too many fluid concepts. Apply agility to your governance and your organisation will be a much better place to work. The end.
That's really, really good. Thank you, Tony. So yeah, that's fantastic. I really learned a lot, and I think what I really enjoy about your talks is that it's not just about the theory; it's you can really apply it. And I'm sure you'll all agree with me that there's a lot of, you can see that there's depth behind each of those words. And I think perhaps one thing I just wanted to check with everyone is there were a couple of terms used which might not have been fully explained. I think that David, you put a comment in there asking what Gemba was, and I think we'll put a link in for that one.
Brilliant.
I think there's directional decisions. There's I think the use of the word integrity was probably not is more the agile use of the term rather than the English word, I would imagine. So I think I perhaps just wanted to check with everyone if we wanted to ask Tony to sort of describe any of those words that you might not have got the full understanding of.
I could do that in about 2 seconds, so I'm happy to do that for you if you like. Gemba is the Japanese word which was really popularized out of the lean TPS system. I spent 3 years working with the Toyota guys, so I'm sorry it becomes my natural language. Gemba is where the work gets done. So they call it a Gemba walk. And in fact, our stand-ups that we use in Agile are framed around the reference of the Gemba walk, because they would come to the Gemba, and Saiichi, Toyota, and etc. would not talk to the leaders. They would actually want to talk to the people who do the work. And I've actually seen that, right? Because they want to hear what happens, and then they would go back and they would stand up with their leaders and say, I see these things are wrong. What do I need to do to make that work for you? You go fix. And that's what the Gemba walk is. So hopefully that helps. Directional decisions. Directional decisions are everything that leaders and anybody who works in any organization makes. You are asked about something, you give a direction, you tell someone to go in a direction, or you make a direction. It is a directional decision. Every single person makes a directional decision. I make a directional decision when I get up out of bed. Which side of the bed am I going to get out? The good side or the bad side? That was a directional decision. According to the family at home, I get out the bad side regularly, but that's beside the point, right? But directional decisions are those decisions that everybody is making. And if you think about it in the frame of reference that I was using it, when you're making directional decisions, you're making decisions that affect your organization, the people to work with, and the way the actual work gets done. Sorry, I'm getting crazy. Was there another one that I missed?
Well, the third one that I mentioned is that the word integrity is my understanding is that it's not referring to the moral side of things, but more the perhaps the way the word is used within agile frameworks.
Yeah, it's really about the integrity of the thing that you put in place. Even if you think about it in software, integrity has 2 words, right? Integrity would be that piece about my integrity. I'm not poking at that. I'm using the integrity of the system of work that you put in place. Is it the purpose? Is it the sum of the whole? Is it going to, the integrity of a glass? If I put the water in, is it one of those cups where the water just goes, or one of those coffee cups I get every time I wear a white shirt? Hopefully that helps everyone.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And perhaps open the floor to questions. And if there are any other words that you want Tony to describe, you're welcome to ask as well.
As long as they're nice.
So any thoughts or questions?
I couldn't see the chat, so.
I might jump in and just say I've sort of come from a traditional project management background, but in the last 10 years have moved into the agile space more, and have balanced that traditional with the agile, and I can see it going on all around me that it's a balancing act. It's not that in a lot of industries it's not just agile, and I think that's what I was alluding to at the beginning of the meeting, maybe before a lot of people joined, is I can see it landing in a hybrid space where agile is the advantages of agile are really are demonstrated and understood, but the management, particularly in government, but also enterprise to some extent, but probably more government, it's hard to shift. It's hard to shift their responsibilities for public funding and all those things to take a leap and accept where things are at. So you've got to find that hybrid, that overlay of governance that gives them what they need to manage up while still doing agile underneath and getting the work done. So that's just the experience that I see in industry and across things. And I sort of lucky enough to sit across many government and industry areas where we sort of, where we're across that. So it almost feels like it's finding a level, that people, and I'm sure there's industries where agile in its purest sense can happen, but there's a few where they just won't let it in, but they get it and they want it, but the organisation just won't let them go for it.
Yeah, and I see that. I'm working with a government organisation is going, will remain nameless, but they're going through some of this at the moment. However, by playing those frames of reference that I talked to today, what I have got them to the well is looking at. So, for example, having 76 signatures to sign one document off, is that a necessity? They're starting to glean those away, right? The other thing I would say to you is a conversation that's very useful is using the remote frame. I host regularly leadership conference that we used to put together as Elaborate, and we brought them together after the remote. And one of the leaders made one of the best quotes. She said, basically, when we sent everyone home, we relaxed all the rules because we needed to get the work done. We needed to get things happening, and we needed to survive. Now we've come back, we're actually looking at our rules and our audit and our risk and et cetera, and we're assessing that as to, well, if nothing bad happened, then do we need all of these? So actually what they're looking at is the minimum marketable piece that they need to do to actually ensure that they have the right balance of governance versus agility versus assurity. Yeah. So you know what I'm saying, that you throw the baby out with the bathwater, people.
So COVID has almost forced people to reevaluate and accept a different outcome that might have taken 5 or 10 years to get them there. Yeah. In some respects, yeah. Cool.
Anybody else got thoughts, questions? Happy to take them. Even if you disagree with me, I don't mind.
A nice framework.
Thanks, Shane.
I was going to build on Tony B's question before. What does it mean for frontline leaders who are just above the level of plankton in the organisation? What is the first step? We're not CTOs, we're not CEOs who can just wave a wand and just make this the way we want it to. What is the first step to take if you're a team leader who's trying to do some of this stuff?
So I work with lots of those, obviously, as you would imagine. I've just finished working with an organisation who's decided to put Agile back in. And one of those instances, okay, we can't change the sum of the whole at the moment, but what we can do is we can apply these methods and these thoughts against the actual, where we have the sphere of influence, right? While still plugging into what we need to. So again, as I said, as many people here will know, I'm a realist, not an evangelist when it comes to agility. And I understand that there's a journey in every organization, pure Agile, pure Scrum, pure whatever you like. I've never actually seen that work unless you've started a startup, right? Because you've got that opportunity to greenfield everything. So that's a different instance. So you have to look at it in the frames of those. What I know is once you start doing that, people start taking notice, and then you start having the conversations. And as long as you're doing it in a way that's not going to truncate your organization's safety, then usually, or your own safety, essentially you start to get those organizational changes. I always gravitate to what Alistair Coburn told me many years ago when I was first trying to get Agile with another of my friends, Craig Smith, if you know, and Renee. He said, it's going to take some fun. Whatever you do what you need to do. Don't get fired and don't go to jail. So I always think so. I hope that helps. I saw somebody put minimum viable governance. Yeah, as long as it doesn't become maximum volume governance. Because that's what happens with minimum viable product. Anything else? Any questions? What was that?
So from Michael, he says, when we run out of questions, he's keen to hear stories from Toyota.
It's an interesting thing when you get to see that actually, and you hear the concepts of the end-on cord and things like that. I managed to visit the Toyota factory and was there when they actually did pull the end-on cord, and it's quite startling because I was talking to people and suddenly they weren't there. It was like one of those things in the movie where the papers were dropped and they just disappeared and went over there, and everybody was running from everywhere. So They do live and breathe and eat it. Yeah, it's an interest.
Wow.
So, well, I guess we're a bit over time, John. So if
We are. So
back their evening, I know I'm holding court here, but I'm not.
no worries at all. Well, I think everyone's deep in thought because they still need to digest it, because there's so much in what you've said that I think that that people will still be thinking about it for days to come. How do they get hold of you if they want to learn more about remote AF, or if they want to explore things further?
Sure, not a problem. Everybody send an email to John. No. No, literally, look, I'm easy enough to find you. Find me on LinkedIn, which is an easy way just to ping me if you want. Or the other one, obviously, is remote.af.co, and then just go to the contact button there, and that'll find its way to me as well. If you're really interested in the govern agility piece, because that's the open source piece of it, right? Rather than those pieces, you can go to governagility.com.au. And you'll find a lot more in-depth information. So I suggest having a read, because that might help with some of the questions, and then you can touch base with us. Other than that, you can touch base with John if you can't find me in any of those methods, or even Mr. Hasty. You can send Mr. Hasty an email as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Tony. That was really enjoyable, and really looking forward to seeing you at some stage in the future.
In the flesh.
Yes, hopefully in the flesh. Absolutely.
I'm just going to press the